Sophia Reynolds stood on the balcony of her pristine suburban home, gazing out at the manicured lawns and neatly trimmed hedges that lined her quiet, affluent neighborhood. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over everything it touched, bathing the world in a light that made everything seem just a little bit more perfect. In that moment, Sophia was the picture of contentment, a woman who had everything she could possibly want. Her life was one that most people only dreamed of. She was a partner at a prestigious law firm where her reputation as a sharp and relentless attorney was well earned. Her husband, Michael, was a successful architect whose designs were sought after by the city's elite. Their home, an elegant Victorian with a wraparound porch and a garden that could have graced the pages of a lifestyle magazine, was the envy of the neighborhood. To everyone who knew her, Sophia was the epitome of success and happiness. Yet, as she stood there, surrounded by the trappings of a perfect life, Sophia felt a flicker of unease, a shadow that passed quickly through her mind, leaving behind a lingering sense of discomfort. She brushed it aside, attributing it to the stress of her latest case. But even as she tried to push the feeling away, it clung to her, stubborn and insistent. Michael joined her on the balcony, wrapping his arms around her from behind. His touch was warm, familiar, comforting. She leaned back into him, closing her eyes and letting herself relax into the moment. "Long day?" he asked, his voice low and soothing. "Very," she replied, allowing herself a small sigh. "But it's good to be home." He kissed the top of her head and rested his chin on her shoulder. "Dinner's almost ready. I thought we could open that bottle of wine we've been saving." "That sounds perfect," she said, smiling up at him. But even as she said the words, the sense of unease gnawed at the edges of her mind. She forced herself to ignore it, focusing instead on the warmth of Michael's embrace and the familiar rhythm of their life together. "Is everything okay?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Michael looked up from his plate, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Of course. Why do you ask?" "I don't know. You just seem a little distant tonight," she said, searching his face for any sign of the man she knew so well. He reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles. "I'm fine, Sophia. Just a bit tired, that's all." She nodded, but the uneasy feeling refused to leave her. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, her mind replaying the conversation over and over, looking for something, anything that might explain the nagging sensation that something was wrong. Later that night, as she lay in bed beside Michael, she stared up at the ceiling, her thoughts spinning. She couldn't shake the feeling that her life, this perfect, beautiful life, was somehow slipping through her fingers. But that was ridiculous, wasn't it? Everything was fine. More than fine. She had everything she'd ever wanted. So why did she feel like she was losing something she couldn't even name? The days that followed did little to ease her mind. In fact, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. At work, she found herself staring at the faces of her colleagues, wondering why they seemed slightly different, slightly distant. The jokes that once made her laugh now felt forced. The camaraderie she once enjoyed felt strained. She began to question whether the people around her were really the friends and colleagues she had always known, or if they were merely playing roles in a carefully constructed play, one that was beginning to fall apart at the seams. It wasn't just her colleagues either. When she met up with her best friend Rachel for their weekly lunch, Sophia noticed the same strange distance in her. The easy laughter they used to share felt stilted, the conversation awkward. There were moments when Rachel seemed to forget things they had talked about, just days before. Small details that should have been fresh in her memory. And then there was the photo. They were sitting at their usual spot, a cozy corner booth at the cafe they had been frequenting for years, when Rachel pulled out her phone to show Sophia a picture from their last girls' trip. It was a photo of the two of them on the beach, smiling and carefree. But as Sophia looked at it, something about the image unsettled her. The background was slightly blurred, the colors a little too bright, almost as if the picture had been edited to make it look more perfect than it really was. And then there were their faces, familiar but somehow off, like a painting that had been touched up too many times. "Soph, are you okay?" Rachel's voice broke through her thoughts, and Sophia looked up to see her friend watching her with concern. "Yeah, I'm fine," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." But as she handed the phone back to Rachel, the unease that had been growing in her gut twisted into something sharper, something more akin to fear. She couldn't explain it, couldn't put her finger on what exactly was wrong, but she knew deep down that something was. Sophia's once solid foundation was beginning to show cracks, small at first, but widening with each passing day. Her perfect life, this life that everyone envied, was starting to feel like a beautiful illusion, one that was slowly unraveling before her eyes. And the more she tried to hold on to it, the more it seemed to slip away. As she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling once again, Sophia made a decision. She couldn't keep ignoring the signs, couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. She had to find out what was really going on, no matter where that search might lead her. She had to uncover the truth behind the illusion of her perfect life, even if it meant shattering it completely. Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that her life, as perfect as it appeared on the surface, was a carefully constructed illusion. The unsettling sensation had grown too strong to ignore, pushing her to a point where she could no longer simply brush it aside as a symptom of stress or overwork. She needed answers, real answers, and the only way to find them was to start digging into her own past. It began innocuously enough. One Saturday morning, while Michael was out golfing with friends, Sophia decided to clean out the attic. It was something she had meant to do for years, always finding an excuse to put it off. But today, the cluttered space filled with boxes and forgotten belongings seemed like the perfect place to start her search. She told herself she was just clearing out old junk, but deep down she knew she was looking for something, anything that might explain the growing inconsistencies in her life. The attic was dusty and dimly lit, filled with the kind of memories that people often tuck away and forget about. Sophia began opening boxes one by one, sifting through old clothes, forgotten toys, and trinkets from her childhood. It was a strange feeling, sorting through the remnants of her past, and with each box she opened, the unease in her stomach grew stronger. After hours of sorting through the clutter, she found a small, weathered box buried beneath a pile of old blankets. It was different from the others, heavier, more solid. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it, a sense of anticipation mingling with dread. The box was locked, but the key was taped to the underside, almost as if someone had wanted it to be found. Sophia hesitated for a moment before unlocking the box and lifting the lid. Inside, she found a collection of old photographs, documents, and a thick, leather-bound diary. The sight of these items sent a shiver down her spine. There was something almost sacred about them, as if they were relics from a life she barely recognized. The photographs were the first to catch her attention. They were old, much older than she expected, depicting a life that felt both familiar and alien. at the same time. She recognized herself in some of them, but there was something off about the images. The faces were slightly blurred, the colors faded in a way that felt unnatural, as if they had been tampered with. One photo in particular stood out. It showed her and Michael on what appeared to be their wedding day, but the image was hazy, the details obscured as though seen through a thick fog. She couldn't remember the moment it captured, couldn't recall the details of the day, something that should have been etched into her memory. She turned to the documents next, her heart pounding as she read through them. They were important papers, birth certificates, marriage licenses, school records. But like the photographs, they were riddled with inconsistencies. Dates didn't match up, names were misspelled, and addresses led to places she had never been. It was as if her entire life had been pieced together from fragments, hastily constructed and filled with errors. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as she read through an old letter from someone she couldn't remember, addressed to an address she didn't recognize. The letter spoke of a tragic event, a car accident that had taken the life of someone close to her. The details were vague, but the sense of loss and pain that seeped through the words was palpable. It was a loss she couldn't remember, a pain she couldn't feel, and that terrified her more than anything else. The last item in the box was the diary. Its leather cover was worn and cracked, the pages yellowed with age. Sophia hesitated before opening it, almost afraid of what she might find inside. But something compelled her to turn the pages, to read the words that seemed to be calling out to her from another time, another life. The handwriting was hers, unmistakably so, but the life it described was not. The diary entries were filled with stories of heartache, loss, and a life that was far from the perfect existence she knew. The Sophia in the diary was a woman who had suffered deeply, who had lost everything she cared about in a series of tragedies that felt too real to be fiction. The entries spoke of a woman who had been in a terrible car accident, one that had left her broken and scarred, both physically and emotionally. The more she read, the more she realized that this diary was a record of a life she had forgotten, or perhaps a life she had been made to forget. There were entries that detailed her growing despair, her sense of hopelessness, and finally, a desperate decision. The diary spoke of a process, something she had chosen to undergo voluntarily, where her memories were altered, her past rewritten to protect her from the unbearable truth. Sophia's hands shook as she read the final entries. They described her growing desire to escape the pain of her real life, to live in a world where everything was perfect, even if it was a lie. The last entry was the most chilling. It spoke of a decision to enter into a dreamlike state, to live in a carefully constructed reality where the tragedies of her past couldn't reach her. She had chosen this life, the perfect life, but now it was all beginning to unravel. The truth hit her like a cold wave, leaving her breathless and disoriented. Her perfect life was a fiction, a creation of her own mind to shield her from the horrors of her true existence. The inconsistencies, the blurred memories, the sense of unease. All of it was because the illusion was starting to break down. The real world, the real Sophia, was fighting to emerge, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Sophia closed the diary, her mind reeling from the revelations it contained. The life she had known, the life she had built, was a lie. But the truth, the real truth, was something she wasn't sure she could face. The world she had created was crumbling, and she was left standing in the ruins, unsure of who she really was or what her life had been. The search for truth had uncovered more than she had ever expected, and now she had to make a choice. She could continue to live in the illusion, trying to patch the cracks in her perfect life, or she could confront the truth and face the reality she had so desperately tried to escape. Sophia knew that her life would never be the same. The search for truth had only just begun, and the path ahead was dark and uncertain. But one thing was clear. There was no turning back. The illusion of perfection had been shattered, and the real world was waiting for her, whether she was ready to face it or not. Sophia's world was crumbling around her, piece by piece. The diary's revelations had shattered the fragile illusion she had been living in, leaving her adrift in a sea of uncertainty and fear. The more she tried to cling to the remnants of her perfect life, the more they seemed to slip through her fingers. Everything she had once believed to be real was now suspect, every memory tainted by doubt. She had always prided herself on her composure, her ability to remain calm and collected even in the most challenging situations. But now, as she stood on the edge of a precipice, staring into the abyss of her own mind, that composure was slipping away. Sophia felt like she was losing control, not just of her life, but of her very sense of self. The days following her discovery in the attic were a blur. She went through the motions of her daily routine, work, social engagements, dinners with Michael. But everything felt off-kilter, like a stage set slightly askew. The familiar rhythms of her life were disrupted, each day bringing new signs that her world was unraveling. At the office, her colleagues seemed to regard her with a strange mix of concern and distance. Conversations that had once flowed naturally now felt stilted, awkward pauses stretching out uncomfortably. She caught them glancing at her with worried expressions when they thought she wasn't looking, and she began to suspect that they knew something she didn't. Whispers followed her through the corridors, and she found herself paranoid, wondering if everyone around her was in on some elaborate secret. The work that had once been her solace, her refuge from the world, now felt meaningless. Contracts and case files blurred before her eyes, the words swimming on the page as if mocking her inability to focus. She made mistakes, small ones at first, then bigger ones that couldn't be ignored. Her partners began to question her judgment, their voices tinged with concern that only deepened her growing sense of isolation. But it was at home where the cracks in her reality became most apparent. Michael, once her confidant and anchor, now seemed like a stranger. There was a distance in his eyes that had never been there before, a coldness that sent a shiver down her spine every time she tried to reach out to him. Their conversations, once so full of warmth and understanding, were now fraught with tension, each word carefully measured as if they were both walking on eggshells. One night, after another strained dinner filled with silence, Sophia finally confronted him. "Michael, what's going on with us?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. "I feel like, I don't know, like we're drifting apart, like you're hiding something from me." He looked up from his plate, his expression unreadable. "Sophia, nothing's wrong. You're just stressed. We both are. Work's been crazy and you've been distracted lately." "Don't lie to me, Michael," she snapped, her patience wearing thin. "I know something's wrong. I can feel it. You're distant, our friends are acting strange, and She stopped herself, the words catching in her throat. She couldn't tell him about the diary, about the truth she had uncovered. Not yet. She wasn't ready to face that conversation, to bring the darkness of her past into the light of their carefully constructed present. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Sophia, you're overthinking things. We're fine. Everything's fine. You just need to relax." But the reassurance felt hollow. The words empty. Sophia knew deep down that everything was far from fine. The perfect life they had built was teetering on the edge of collapse, and no amount of denial could stop it from falling apart. The nights were the worst. Sleep, once a welcome escape, had become a battleground. She would lie awake for hours, her mind racing with the revelations from the diary, the inconsistencies in her life, the growing sense of dread that something terrible was lurking just out of reach. When she did manage to fall asleep, her dreams were plagued by nightmarish visions, twisted versions of her life, where the faces of her loved ones melted into grotesque shapes, and her home turned into a labyrinth of endless, dark corridors. One night, she awoke with a start, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was dark and silent, but there was a presence, a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. She blinked, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, but the figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving her gasping for breath, her pulse racing. She tried to tell herself it was just a dream, but it felt too real, too tangible, like the boundaries between her nightmares and reality were beginning to blur. Desperate for answers, Sophia returned to the diary, hoping to find some clue, some explanation that would help her make sense of what was happening. But the more she read, the more fragmented her thoughts became. The entries were chaotic, disjointed, filled with references to events and people she couldn't remember. It was as if her mind was trying to reconstruct a past that had been erased, but the pieces didn't fit together, leaving her with a jumbled mess of memories that only deepened her confusion. The diary spoke of a woman consumed by grief, a woman who had lost everything in a tragic accident. A husband, a child, a future. A woman who had chosen to escape her pain by retreating into a fantasy, a perfect life where the past couldn't hurt her. But the fantasy was crumbling, the illusion breaking apart, and the truth was clawing its way to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. Sophia began to see signs of this truth everywhere. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed oppressive, the walls closing in on her. She would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, shadows that disappeared when she turned to look. Objects seemed to move on their own, small things, a book, a photo frame, a piece of jewelry, appearing in places she was certain she hadn't left them. It was as if the house itself was conspiring against her, trying to push her toward a truth she wasn't ready to face. Her interactions with others became increasingly strained. Friends who had once been a source of comfort now seemed alien, their faces unfamiliar, their words laced with hidden meanings. She questioned everything and everyone, her paranoia growing with each passing day. She began to withdraw, isolating herself from the people around her, unable to trust anyone, even herself. The final straw came one afternoon when Sophia received a phone call from Rachel, her closest friend. Rachel's voice was tense, almost frantic, as she asked Sophia to meet her at a small cafe on the other side of town. Sophia hesitated, sensing the urgency in Rachel's tone, but agreed to meet her. When she arrived at the cafe, Rachel was already there, sitting at a corner table, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "Sophia, I need to tell you something," Rachel said, her voice low and trembling. "Something's been wrong for a while now, and I've been trying to figure out how to talk to you about it, but I just couldn't until now." Sophia's heart raced as she listened, her mind filling with 1,000 possible explanations for Rachel's fear. But nothing could have prepared her for what came next. I think something's been done to you," Rachel whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know how to explain it, but there are things about your life that don't add up. It's like someone's been manipulating your memories, your reality, and I don't know why, but I'm scared, Sophia. I'm scared for you." Sophia's blood ran cold as Rachel's words sank in. She had suspected as much, had felt the truth tugging at the edges of her consciousness, but hearing it spoken aloud by someone she trusted made it all too real. The world around her seemed to tilt, the floor dropping out from under her as the full weight of the revelation crashed down upon her. Her perfect life was not just an illusion, it was a prison, a construct designed to keep her trapped in a false reality. And now that reality was unraveling, the truth breaking through the cracks, revealing a nightmare she could no longer escape. Sophia looked at Rachel, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "I need to find out the truth," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "No matter what it is, no matter what it costs me, I need to know what's really going on." Rachel nodded, her expression grim. "I'll help you, Sophia. Whatever it takes, we'll find the truth together." But as they left the cafe, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The unraveling of her reality was accelerating, and the closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. The illusion of perfection was gone, and all that remained was a dark, twisted nightmare from which there was no easy escape. Sophia's journey into the heart of the mystery was just beginning, but she knew one thing for certain. Her life would never be the same. The truth was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. And once it was, there would be no going back. Sophia stood at the threshold of her bedroom, the familiar surroundings now foreign and unsettling. The walls that once held memories of love and comfort now felt like a cage, trapping her in a life that was not her own. The revelations of the past few weeks had shattered her world, leaving her with only fragments of the truth, and the overwhelming fear that she might never be whole again. The diary lay open on the bed, its pages filled with the story of a woman she barely recognized. The life it described was one of pain and loss, a stark contrast to the perfect existence she had believed was hers. But the diary's final entry had revealed the ultimate truth. This perfect life was a carefully constructed lie, a dream she had chosen to live in to escape the unbearable reality of her past. Her real life, the life she had forgotten, was waiting for her on the other side of a choice. The choice she had once made to forget, to immerse herself in a false world of perfection, was now being undone. The cracks in her reality had widened, and now the truth was inescapable. But as Sophia stood there, staring at the diary, she felt the weight of that choice pressing down on her once again. The safety of her dream world called to her, whispering promises of comfort and peace if she would only stay. It would be so easy to retreat, to rebuild the walls around her and sink back into the fantasy where nothing could hurt her. Yet the truth had already begun to seep into every corner of her life, making the dream impossible to maintain. Her husband, her friends, her home, everything was tainted by the knowledge that it was all a lie. The dream had become a nightmare, and the longer she stayed in it, the more it suffocated her. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest as she took a step closer to the bed, her hand reaching out to the diary. The final entry, the one that described the process of her forgetting, the one that spoke of the accident and the life she had lost, was etched into her mind. The words had torn through her like a blade, cutting away the illusion she had lived in for so long. She knew now that her perfect life had been a prison, one she had built herself out of desperation and fear. The truth was terrifying, but it was also liberating. The real world, with all its pain and suffering, was waiting for her. It was a world where she had loved and lost, where she had been broken and scarred. But it was real, and if she was to find herself again, she knew she had to face it. Sophia's hand hovered over the diary, trembling as she hesitated. She could still choose to stay in the dream, to close the diary and live out the rest of her days in the illusion she had created. But deep down, she knew that was no longer an option. The truth had already begun to take root in her mind, and there was no turning back. With a deep breath, Sophia picked up the diary and walked to the window. The night was dark, the sky heavy with clouds, but somewhere beyond the darkness, she knew the dawn was waiting. The thought gave her strength, a flicker of hope that she could survive whatever lay ahead. She opened the window, letting the cool night air wash over her. It was a small act, but it felt like the first breath she had taken in years. The air was crisp and real, carrying with it the sense of earth and life, things she had forgotten in the sterile perfection of her dream world. Without allowing herself to hesitate, Sophia threw the diary out the window. It fell silently into the night, disappearing into the darkness below. She watched it go, feeling a strange sense of peace as it vanished from sight. The diary had been her anchor to the past, but it had also been a chain binding her to the illusion. Now it was gone, and she was free. Turning away from the window, Sophia walked back into the room and stood in front of the mirror. The woman who stared back at her was different from the one she had seen before. There were shadows under her eyes, lines that spoke of worry and pain, but there was also a strength there, a determination that had been missing in the perfect life she had lived. She reached out and touched the mirror, her fingers tracing the outline of her reflection. This was her, the real Sophia, not the version she had created to escape her pain. The woman in the mirror had faced tragedy, had been broken and lost, but she was still here, still standing, and she was ready to wake up. With that thought, a calmness settled over Sophia. The fear was still there, lurking in the corners of her mind, but it no longer controlled her. She had made her choice. She would face the truth, whatever it might be. She would wake up, and she would live. Not in a dream, but in the reality she had once tried to escape. Sophia lay down on the bed, closing her eyes as she prepared to take the final step. The world around her seemed to blur, the lines between dream and reality shifting as she let go of the last remnants of the illusion. She felt herself drifting, the weight of the perfect life lifting from her shoulders as she sank into the darkness. And then, just as she felt herself slipping away, a light began to break through the darkness. It was faint at first, a distant glow that grew stronger with each passing moment. Sophia reached out toward it, drawn by the warmth and the promise of something new. The light enveloped her, washing over her in waves of warmth and clarity. The dream was fading, the illusion dissolving into nothingness, and in its place the real world was emerging, bright, vivid, and unmistakably real. Sophia took a deep breath, the first real breath she had taken in what felt like a lifetime. Her eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in years, she was awake. The hospital room was quiet, the only sound the steady beep of the heart monitor beside her bed. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled her nostrils, and the harsh fluorescent lights overhead made her squint as she tried to adjust to the brightness. But none of it mattered, because she was here, alive, awake, and fully aware. Sophia's heart raced as she looked around, taking in her surroundings. The hospital bed, the machines, the white walls, all of it was real, more real than anything she had experienced in the dream. She was no longer trapped in the perfect life she had created. She was free. A nurse entered the room, her face lighting up with surprise as she saw Sophia awake. "Mrs. Reynolds," she said, rushing to her side, "you're awake. I'll get the doctor right away." Sophia nodded, her throat too dry to speak. She watched the nurse leave, and in the silence that followed, she felt a flood of emotions wash over her: relief, fear, hope, and a deep, aching sadness for the life she had lost. But underneath it all, there was a sense of purpose, a determination to face whatever came next. As she lay there, waiting for the doctor, Sophia thought of Michael, of the life they had shared, and of the future that was now uncertain. She didn't know what would happen next, didn't know what the real world would bring, but she was ready to find out. She had chosen to wake up, to live in the reality she had once fled, and she knew that whatever happened, she would face it with the strength she had rediscovered within herself. The door opened again and the doctor entered, his face kind but serious. "Welcome back, Mrs. Reynolds," he said, taking her hand. "You've been through a lot, but you're going to be okay." Sophia looked up at him, her eyes clear and focused. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "I'm ready to face the truth." And as she spoke those words, she knew they were true. The perfect life was gone, the dream had ended, and now the real story of Sophia Reynolds was about to begin.